All right. The only way to save our planet. There are many strategies that can help improve our environment and give us cleaner air, cleaner water, cleaner food, less exposure to toxins. Things like recycling, organic agriculture, river cleanup efforts, clean energy generation, farmland restoration, alternative cement, creating walkable cities, and more. Many of these strategies are highlighted in Paul Hawkins' book, Drawdown. But there's only one strategy that will save us from overheating the planet and all the fatal consequences of overheating, which are wildfire, sea level rise, drought, famine, and flood. Without that one strategy, all the clean energy and river cleanup and alternative cement in the world won't save us. And we will review in this presentation the two most significant scientific experiments that demonstrated conclusively to humanity what is causing the problem and what that one indispensable solution is. Is anthropomorphic climate change real? The argument often goes, as our new Secretary of State has often said, of course there's climate change. The climate has always been changing. The implication is that there's nothing new or threatening here. There have always been wildfires, there have always been floods, there have always been tornadoes, there have always been heat waves, there have always been droughts. If it seems like there have been more of those things lately, well, that's just lies from the media or coincidence, they might say. So, how do we know that there's real anthropomorphic climate change? And I apologize that these graphs are a little hard to see, but this is you see that line going up. This is from Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii, modern carbon dioxide tracking, which began in 1958 when CO2 in the atmosphere was under 320 parts per million. It's gone up since then, roughly in my lifetime, by about 100 parts per million. Based on the annual report from NOAA's Global Monitoring Lab, global average atmospheric carbon dioxide was 419 parts per million in 2023, setting a new record high. The increase between 2022 and 2023 was 2.8 parts per million, which was the 12th year in a row where the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere increased by more than 2 parts per million. Well, what's the problem with that? Are we going to have trouble breathing when, in say, 30 years, CO2 reaches 500 parts per million? No, we won't have a problem breathing air that's 500 parts per million. But we may have trouble breathing because of all the wildfires around us and all the smoke in the air. The problem with increased CO2 concentration at current levels isn't our ability to breathe it in. Indoor air can go way above 500 parts per million because we exhale CO2 all day long. The problem is the heating effect of increased CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. And when was the scientific experiment done that established the heating effect of CO2? It was done in 1856 by a woman named Eunice Newton Foote. This was the woman who explained to the world 100 years before I was born the dilemma we would face if we kept increasing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Eunice Foote lived from 1819 to 1888. She was a women's rights activist and abolitionist. She was right about everything. And so when she told the world that we would effectively be heating it up by adding CO2 to the atmosphere, somebody should have listened. She was considered an amateur scientist, but here's the experiment conducted by this amateur scientist that may have been the most important experiment ever. In order to demonstrate the interactions of sunlight on different gases, she used an air pump, 2 glass cylinders, and 4 thermometers. In each cylinder, she placed 2 thermometers and then used the pump to evacuate the air from one cylinder and compress it in the other cylinder. When both cylinders reached equal ambient temperature, they were placed in the sunlight and temperature variances were measured. She also placed the containers in the shade for comparison and tested the temperature results by dehydrating one cylinder and adding water to the other to measure the effect of dry versus moist air. but noted that the amount of moisture in the air impacted the temperature results. She performed this experiment on air, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen, finding that the tube filled with carbon dioxide became hotter than the others when exposed to sunlight. She wrote, quote, "The receiver containing this gas became itself much heated, very sensibly more so than the other, and on being removed from the sun, it was many times as long in cooling." So in 1856, it was established scientifically that carbon dioxide and water vapor in the atmosphere have a heating effect. This should not be in dispute in the year 2025. The science has held up for 169 years. According to Wikipedia, the 1856 edition of the American Journal of Science and Arts published Foote's complete paper under her given name, immediately following a paper by her husband, Alicia. Other than those on astronomy, the paper was the first known physics publication in a scientific journal by an American woman. Some summaries of her work were published widely, including in Scientific American in 1856. Scientific American wrote about her work, quote, "This, we are happy to say, has been done by a lady," and noted that, quote, "she was deeply acquainted with almost every branch of physical science." So Scientific American may have been a wee bit patronizing back in 1856, but extraordinarily enough, Foote connected her work to the possibility of climate change, writing, quote, "An atmosphere of that gas, CO2, would give to our Earth a high temperature, and if, as some suppose, at one period of its history, the air had mixed with it a larger proportion than at present, an increased temperature from its own action must have necessarily resulted," unquote. So we know that atmospheric CO2 is on the rise. And we know that CO2 is not the only atmospheric gas that traps heat. In fact, methane and nitrous oxide trap far more heat. We also know that surface temperatures on the Earth have been rising. This is a graph of from NASA of Earth surface temperatures. It's the change in global surface temperature compared to the long-term average from 1951 to 1980. And it's simply impossible to look at this data and conclude that it's just random and that the temperature of the Earth, that it's just random that the temperature of the Earth keeps going up. I know of no other serious explanation that's ever been put forward other than greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. This should be considered settled science. Human activity is warming the planet, and we see the consequences. It's my opinion that wildfire is the greatest threat from climate change. We had the horrific fires in the Los Angeles area in January of this year. Pacific Palisades and Altadena were practically wiped off the map. In 2023, we had the deadly fire in Maui. 18 of the 20 most destructive fires in California history have occurred since the year 2000. The others were in 1999 and 1991. 19 of the 20 largest wildfires in California history have taken place in the last 20 years, and about half of them in the last 5 years. California is about 100 million acres, and historically, between 100,000 and 1 million acres would burn annually. Before 2008, California had never seen more than 1 million acres burn in 1 year, but that year there were over 1.4 million acres burned. Since then, there have been 4 other million-acre plus years, with the largest in 2020 when a whopping 4.3 million acres burned. The fires have also been unprecedented in scope in Australia, whose climate has warmed by more than 1 degree Celsius over the past century, causing an increase in frequency and intensity of heat waves and droughts. 8 of Australia's 10 warmest years on record have occurred since 2005. A study in 2018 conducted at Melbourne University found that the major droughts of the late 20th century and early 21st century in southern Australia are, quote, likely without precedent over the past 400 years. Across the country, the average summer temperatures have increased, leading to record-breaking hot weather, with the early summer of 2019 the hottest on record. 2019 was also Australia's driest year ever since 1900, with rainfall 40% lower than average. Okay. And we also suffer from climate whiplash. Places that were historically wet are becoming dry and vice versa. Other places are now increasingly battered by both extreme floods and droughts. The cities facing varying climate extremes face risk of infrastructure that cannot keep up with the shifts in wet or dry weather events. Extreme flooding threatens water sanitation and waste systems, which can lead to disease spread. On the other hand, extreme drought puts strain on water resources. The California wildfires this year were brought about by heavy rains last year that led to increased vegetation, then a dry spell that reduced that vegetation to dry brush. The fires were followed by rains that led to mudslides. Cities all around the world are facing climate whiplash. Flooding is increasing for more than one climate change related reason. First, there's sea level rise. This is a graph of sea level rise over the last 150 years. Does it remind you of the charts of atmospheric carbon dioxide over time and the chart of global surface temperature over time? It's just a relentless, steady increase. In America, we've had an increase in coastal flooding events, even high tide flood events when the sun is shining in cities from Boston to San Diego. When you have high tide flooding combined with storms, then you have the potential for record-breaking flooding, and hurricanes are made all the more likely and all the more powerful by the heating of the oceans. I'm quoting here from the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, quote, warmer sea surface temperatures intensify tropical storm speeds, giving them the potential to deliver more damage if they make landfall. Over the 39-year period from 1979 to 2017, the number of major hurricanes has increased while the number of smaller hurricanes has decreased. Based on modeling, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration predicts an increase in Category 4 and 5 hurricanes alongside increased hurricane wind speeds. Warmer sea temperatures also cause wetter hurricanes with 10 to 15% more precipitation from storms projected. Recent storms such as Hurricane Harvey in 2017, which dropped more than 60 inches in some locations, Florence in 2018, and Imelda in 2019 demonstrate the devastating floods that could be triggered by these high-end hurricanes. Sea level rise is already making coastal storms more damaging and is expected to continue worsening. Globally, average sea level has risen over half a foot since 1900 and is expected to rise 1 to 2.5 feet during this century. Coastal regions will experience the worst of these effects. Sea level rise increases the risk of coastal flooding and has intensified the impact of several recent storms. A study of Hurricane Katrina estimated that higher sea levels led to flood elevations 15 to 60% higher than climate conditions in 1900. A study of Hurricane Sandy estimated that sea levels at the time increased the likelihood of flooding by 3 times, and that additional rising will make severe flooding 4 times more likely in the future. Rising temperatures decrease surface soil moisture. Therefore, without a decline in precipitation, you could get dry conditions and conditions ripe for fire. According to the Union of Concerned Scientists, quote, the Southwest is considered one of the most sensitive regions globally to increased drought risk caused by climate change. With cruel irony, drought can affect our ability to generate clean hydroelectric power and cause us to rely on dirtier fuels for power. And when drought leads to wildfire, it enhances a vicious spiral by unleashing tons of carbon into the atmosphere, warming the atmosphere further and thereby reducing soil moisture. When we lose trees, we lose their capacity to sequester carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store carbon as wood. And the root systems of healthy trees will store at least as much carbon underground as the trees store above ground. There's more carbon in soils than in vegetation. So when the soils become dry and dusty, a lot of that carbon blows into the atmosphere. In the words of the Union of Concerned Scientists, quote, much of the U.S. Mountain West has experienced a decline in spring snowpack since the middle of the 20th century. These declines are related to climate change because warming temperatures have reduced the amount of precipitation falling as snow as opposed to rain and shifted the timing of snowmelt. Earlier snowmelt associated with these warmer temperatures can lead to water supplies being out of sync with water demands, unquote. Droughts can create shortages of drinking water, food, hydroelectric power, and they can lead to wildfire. We've already tapped many of the natural aquifers that have been used to compensate for droughts. In 2023, Phoenix broke a record with 55 days over 110 degrees. A year later, it broke that record with 70 days over 110 degrees in 2024. 113 days in a row of temperatures over 100 degrees. The summer in 2024 was almost 2 degrees hotter than the record-breaking summer of 2023, in which 22 days were over 115 degrees, breaking the previous record of 14 days in 2020. Let's talk about the first efforts to save our planet from human-caused climate change. Once the evidence of anthropomorphic climate change became undeniable, the first conference of the parties, COP1, to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, took place in 1995 in Berlin, Germany. That was COP1. The 2024 UN Climate Change Conference, or COP29, took place in Azerbaijan in November 2024. In all of these 29 conferences, almost the exclusive focus was on the burning of fossil fuels as the cause of global warming and ways to replace dirty fossil fuels with clean energy. How much progress have we made in the last 30 years focusing on clean energy? I apologize again for this graph, but this is the green represents the amount of gas consumption, the red is oil consumption, and the blue is coal consumption. And as you could see, over the last, this is a graph of how many years? Let me see. This is a graph of 170 years, but over the last 30 years, the graphs just keep going up. Global fossil fuel consumption has increased significantly, with more than half of all CO2 emissions since 1751 occurring in this period, and emissions continue to grow rapidly. We burn far more coal, gas, and oil than we burned 29 years ago at the first international COP summit in Berlin. This is fossil fuel consumption per capita since 1965, and you see some of the lines go down for different parts of the world, and some go up. But this is per capita. So over the last 60 years, fossil fuel consumption has come down slightly in the US per capita, and in some countries in Europe, while it's gone way up in China and India and Australia. But this is per capita, so it's misleading. Our population in the US has gone up by 75% since 1965. The atmosphere doesn't particularly care about how much fossil fuels we're burning per person. It cares about how much in the way of greenhouse gases is being added to the atmosphere cumulatively. And so even with a lower fossil fuel consumption per capita in the US now since 1965, our total fossil fuel emissions have increased. This is a map of the world showing what share of their energy generation came from the burning of fossil fuels in 2023. The darker colors represent about 80 to 90% of energy generation from fossil fuels. And as you can see, that's most countries. Africa is mostly white just because of the lack of data. Again, after 29 years of global summits, the progress on limiting fossil fuel burning is somewhere between negligible and negative. Here's our progress on coal production. There's been no global progress on limiting the production of our dirtiest fossil fuel, coal. China has over 1,100 operating coal-fired plants, generating over half of the world's coal-fired power. This blue line, whoops, this blue line here represents China. And they keep building more plants, even though the industry is struggling and half of those plants are losing money. The atmosphere doesn't particularly care where the coal burning comes from. The problem, again, is cumulative in one global atmosphere that we all share. Let's talk about the Faustian bargain. When you burn fossil fuels, yes, the resulting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere heats the atmosphere. But you also produce aerosols, tiny particles, including sulfur dioxide, that reflect sunlight and thereby mask greenhouse gas warming by actually cooling the atmosphere. This was dubbed the Faustian bargain by James Hansen, who's considered the father of US climate science, because the deal is we get the temporary cooling effects of aerosols, these sulfur dioxide particles, while becoming more and more addicted to the fossil fuel burning that is destructive to our world in so many ways. As much as 75% of the heating from fossil fuel burning may be offset by cooling aerosols from fossil fuel burning. This is why volcanic eruptions sometimes cool the atmosphere. They send sulfur particles into the atmosphere. This is why a technological fix has sometimes been suggested for the climate crisis, intentionally further polluting our atmosphere by sending sulfur dioxide particles into it. It's called stratospheric atmospheric injection, and it would be like mimicking a volcano. These sulfate aerosols would reflect sunlight back into space. There's a risk that this form of experiment on our atmosphere could damage the ozone in the atmosphere that protects us against UV rays. Fine aerosols in the lower atmosphere only last for days, while in the upper atmosphere they could last for a couple of years. So the aerosol cooling that we get from burning fossil fuels is very short-lived, but its effects continue because we continue burning fossil fuels. So what if we stop burning fossil fuels tomorrow? Starting tomorrow, no gas engines, no burning of oil or coal for heat or energy, no cooking with gas, etc. What would happen? What would happen, counterintuitively, is that the planet would heat up because all the lower atmosphere aerosols would disappear quickly while the carbon dioxide already in the atmosphere would remain. So all of our focus on ending fossil fuel consumption as the way to stop global warming should come with an asterisk. If we do it overnight, and of course we can't, it would actually heat up the climate to suddenly stop burning fossil fuels. In the words of MIT Climate, quote, we should brace ourselves for even more warming while fossil fuels decline as our past CO2 emissions linger and our sulfate emissions quickly disappear. So far, we've established that human-made climate change is real, that the science that established the understanding of how we heat our own climate was really settled over 150 years ago, that efforts to curtail fossil fuel emissions have failed spectacularly over the last 30 years, that we burn more fossil fuels now than we did 30 years ago, that more heat and energy in the atmosphere lead to wildfire, floods, droughts, sea level rise, more intense hurricanes and heat domes, and that if we magically stop burning all fossil fuels tomorrow, the heat would only get worse, thanks to the Faustian bargain. It's hard to see that climate glass as half full. Let's re-examine now the assumption that this whole discussion has been based upon. Climate change is caused by the burning of fossil fuels, right? Well, in part, it's a big factor. The burning of fossil fuels, though, is the second leading cause of climate change, and it's a distant second. The leading cause of climate change is animal agriculture. And we know that as long as we factor in carbon opportunity cost, and I'll explain what that is. 37% of the world's non-ice land surface is currently grazed. If even less than half of that is restored to forest, we can sequester enough carbon dioxide to return to pre-industrial revolution levels of CO2. The signature greenhouse gases of animal agriculture, which are methane and nitrous oxide, are far, far more powerful greenhouse gases than carbon dioxide. Methane is 120 times as powerful. Nitrous oxide is 300 times as powerful. If we simply end animal agriculture, we could overcome the climate emergency by rewilding the land currently being wasted by animal agriculture. That's carbon opportunity cost, the cost of not having the trees there to sequester the carbon dioxide. Again, that's 37% of the non-ice land surface of the Earth, plus another 6% that's being wasted growing grain to feed to the animals that people eat. Now, I'm not the only one saying this. Dr. Silas Rao, whom I've interviewed on my podcast, wrote a peer-reviewed scientific paper estimating that at least 87% of greenhouse gases stem from animal agriculture. This on the screen here is an article published just a few weeks ago. Sorry if you can't see the title there. Livestock agriculture named as leading cause of climate change. This is an article published just a few weeks ago by Green Queen, which describes itself as the world's leading food and climate media focusing on future food innovation and food system decarbonization. It's premised on a new paper by the Australian climate scientist Gerard Wedderburn Bishop, whom I interviewed recently on my podcast. I think that'll air in about a week or two. And let me quote from the article. In the study, Australian climate scientist Gerard Wedderburn Bishop, co-founder of the World Preservation Foundation, notes that the IPCC's Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change greenhouse gas accounting rules were developed 3 decades ago, while recent advances have improved our understanding of what causes climate change. According to his assessment, agriculture, the most extensive land user, caused 60% of global warming between 1750 and 2020, with meat and dairy farming alone responsible for 53% of the total. In contrast, fossil fuels contributed to 19% of warming in this period, less than a third of the food production sector. Quote, agriculture becomes the major disruptor of 5 planetary boundaries: biosphere integrity, land system change, freshwater change, biogeochemical flows, and climate change, writes Wedderburn Bishop. This emphasizes the need for policies to address this sector if we are to have a livable future. But how could it be that we've been so wrong about the leading cause of an unprecedented threat to civilization? Why are we being misled? Is there some sort of conspiracy not to tell the public the truth and not to give us the obvious solution to the problem? Why is animal agriculture rarely discussed and most of the leading climate spokesmen like Al Gore concentrate solely on fossil fuel burning? Well, first there's the visual bias. You can see smokestacks from energy plants and manufacturing plants belching carbon dioxide and other pollutants into the air. You can't see the methane and carbon dioxide being produced by 1.5 billion cattle on the planet. And then let's add in the sheep and goats and the manure from 25 billion farmed animals, which also generates both methane and nitrous oxide. Most of us don't see the lagoons of manure that are fouling our landscape. We also don't see the forests that are no longer there, that have been cut down or burned to make room for cows, and the land that has been gradually grazed into desert. When you're part of a culture that eats meat, you don't question whether or not we need the grazing land and how much carbon dioxide we might sequester if we restored forests. You don't question whether or not we need 25 billion farmed animals on the planet. Just as medical schools don't question whether it might make sense to teach nutrition, because they assume that our culture will never change its dietary habits. Just as doctors don't ask their patients what they eat, because they assume that Americans are meat eaters and can never change. Just as our pandemic spokesman never dared to mention nutrition, climate scientists don't challenge land use. And the fact that we absurdly dedicate 43% of the non-ice land surface of the Earth to the growing of animals for food. They don't question the destruction of the oceans, which is 70% of the planet, so that humans can obtain, get this, 3% of their food calories from fish. So as long as you don't question these things, as long as they're givens, unchallengeable cultural assumptions, then of course you have no choice but to focus on fossil fuels. There's nothing else to talk about. So you're left to focus on the second leading cause of climate change. We are the foray. The foray, you see a picture of them there. The foray people of Papua New Guinea had a big problem in the 1950s and 1960s. Many were dying of a horrible disease called kuru, which was their word for shivering. The victims would shake and develop facial spasms and lose the ability to walk and to control their bodily functions and to swallow, and then they would die. It's 100% fatal. It affected mostly women and some children. It was due to their unfortunate practice of cannibalism. The women had decided not long before the 1950s that it was a shame to waste the good meat of their dead relatives and allow it to be eaten by worms. And so the tradition grew to honor their loved ones by consuming the whole corpse, all cooked and eaten, including the brains. This was in part revenge against the men who always ate the best parts of pigs and gave women the leftovers. As payback, the women ate more of their loved ones than did the men, and it was always the women who ate the brains, or they may have shared a little bit of the brain with their children. Well, it turns out, ironically, that eating brains is not smart. Many foray women were dying of kuru, so many that the male to female ratio began to approach 3-to-1. It was ultimately determined with the help of a Nobel Prize winning researcher named Carlton Gajdusek. It was determined that there was an infectious agent involved in kuru that was not actually alive. It's a misfolded protein now called a prion. Prion diseases include scrapie in sheep, mad cow disease in cows, chronic wasting disease in deer, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease in humans, and kuru in humans. About one in a million people will, for no known reason, get a misfolded protein, a prion, in their brain and develop Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, always fatal. That must have happened to one of the foray people. But then when his or her infected brain was eaten by many women, they got kuru, and then when their brains were eaten, you can see why it's not smart to eat brains. But the foray were taught by Westerners to stop with the cannibalism. And they stopped. And they're not dying of kuru anymore. Now, it's easy to condemn cannibalism, which seems like a terribly primitive, unthinkable crime against nature and humanity. But from a health perspective, it's really no different than eating cows. From a health perspective, flesh is flesh. Cow, horse, pig, fish, or person. We can look down on a culture that was cannibalistic, but there's no scientific reason to believe that eating cows is any more sensible or healthy for human beings than eating your uncle. And our decisions on what we should eat are just as irrationally grounded in cultural traditions as the decisions made by the foray. If anything, our culture has proven more resistant to change than theirs. We are the foray. And in overcoming our misguided cultural habits of eating animals, we now need to try to emulate their comparative openness to progress. And so the only way to save our planet involves a dauntingly difficult transition. The whole population of the world needs to evolve towards a plant-based diet. If we could achieve that, we could free up the 43% of the non-ice land surface of the Earth that is being burnt and eroded and turned into desert as it's exploited for animal agriculture. We could allow as much of that land as possible to be returned to forests and allow the vegetation to grow back. That would sequester enough carbon dioxide to cool the planet and end the climate emergency. This is a picture of land that was grazed on the left side here, a once barren landscape in 2002. This is land that was grazed in Koresh, India, near the edge of the Thar Desert, and then rewilded. This is what it looks like 4 years later. This is the difference 4 years of rewilding can make. Imagine if we allowed that to happen to 37% of the land on Earth that is grazed. This is a picture I have on the cover of my book, Food is Climate. This is a NASA fire map. The red dots represent the pasture maintenance fires on just one day. These fires are set to burn all vegetation that cows don't eat. Nobody is quantifying how much carbon is being released into the atmosphere from these fires, and the IPCC is not factoring in how much vegetation and forest are lost to create grazing land. Look at the deserts, the brown areas from the Sahara in northern Africa to the deserts in the Middle East to the Thar Desert in northern India to the Gobi Desert in China, a 6,000-mile stretch of mostly desert. And we know that it was all forested or was savanna in the past. So what happened? The Sahara was forested less than 10,000 years ago. So what happened less than 10,000 years ago? Humans began cutting down trees and grazing goats and cattle on the land, exacerbating other factors. Humans are clearing the Amazon now for cattle grazing, and one day soon there will be a big patch of brown in South America called the Amazonian Desert. So let's compare social goods between the burning of fossil fuels and eating animal foods. The burning of fossil fuels provides transportation, heating, energy generation, the warming of homes, fuel for cooking, virtually all manufactured goods. That's a lot of social goods. I'm not an apologist for the fossil fuel industry, but you've got to admit that we've all benefited in many ways from the burning of fossil fuels. We can't fly in airplanes without burning fossil fuels. Eating animals, what does that provide? Well, eating animals provides obesity, heart disease, cancer, diabetes, autoimmune diseases, food poisoning, pandemics, noxious lagoons of manure, prolific waste of water and grain, and less food. We call people who raise animals for food farmers. But remember, they're actually reducing our supply of food when they feed grain and other food to their animals. So if you define a farmer as a person who grows food, they're not really farmers, are they? They're anti-farmers. We are destroying life on the planet. Animal agriculture and industrial fishing are the leading causes of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, deforestation and desertification, ocean dead zones, biodiversity loss, water scarcity, and pandemics. It's not just climate change that animal agriculture is responsible for. It's breaking all the planetary boundaries that we must stay within for life to be sustainable. Is it worth it to cause all that damage for a burger? The bun is made from wheat. You don't need animal agriculture for the bun. You don't need it for the lettuce or the pickle or the tomato or the mustard. All you have to do is replace that fatty beef patty with a portobello mushroom or a bean burger or a soy burger or a lentil burger or any kind of veggie burger. It won't taste so fatty. In fact, it'll taste better, and your taste buds will quickly learn to appreciate not eating so much fat, and it'll be far healthier. But how do we know what we should eat? Humans are the only animals who've lost the instinct to know what our food is. All other animals exist in nature and naturally eat the food they're designed to eat, but humans are raised indoors and we are fed the food that our cultures deem to be right for us. It's different in different, this is different in different cultures, but almost all cultures eat animal foods. So here's the second crucial experiment that I referred to. This one took place in 1913. I mentioned at the start of this presentation that there were two significant scientific experiments that demonstrated conclusively to humanity what is causing the problem and what the one indispensable solution is. It was Eunice Foote who taught us what the problem is, even before the problem was much of a problem: greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that heat the climate. Then in 1913 came the experiment that should have taught us the solution, though even the lead researcher couldn't figure it out. But this is as good an experiment as ever been accomplished to teach us what we should eat, although unfortunately some rabbits had to suffer for it. Dr. Nikolai Anichkov, you could see him at the far left of the photograph here. He lived from 1885 to 1964. He conducted an experiment in 1913 in St. Petersburg, Russia. Atherosclerosis was commonly seen during autopsies, so doctors in the early 1900s assumed that it was a normal part of aging, as many doctors do today, by the way. In 1908, Russian pathologists found that they could cause atherosclerosis in rabbits by feeding them on eggs, milk, and meat instead of their usual rabbit food, vegetables. They did not know why these foods caused atherosclerosis, though some thought it was the protein and others thought it was the fat. In 1913, Dr. Anichkov fed egg yolks to the rabbits and found that this caused atherosclerosis. He then purified cholesterol from the egg yolks and found that the purified cholesterol alone, without the fat or protein, caused atherosclerosis. Anichkov showed that cholesterol alone caused the atheromatous changes in the vascular wall. It was later demonstrated that when egg yolks were fed to omnivores like the dog or to carnivores, atherosclerosis did not develop. So let's do the math. Anichkov proves that cholesterol, which is present in all animal cells but not in plants, causes vascular disease in herbivores, in rabbits. It's subsequently proven that cholesterol fed to omnivores and carnivores does not produce atherosclerosis. Atherosclerosis, as we know, occurs in humans. It's the cause of heart disease and strokes. Conclusion: humans are herbivores. We are like Anichkov's experimental rabbits, but we willingly inflict this injury on ourselves by willingly eating cholesterol. Anichkov himself did not, amazingly enough, come to the conclusion that humans should not eat cholesterol and go vegan. He continued, like most people, to eat animal foods, and he died of a heart attack in 1964. On the next slide, I'm going to give you the complete list of all the animals in the world that develop atherosclerosis. This is the complete list. Only humans develop atherosclerosis because it is a disease, as has been proven, that occurs only in herbivores that do not eat an herbivorous diet. No other herbivore besides humans is foolish enough to eat animal foods. As meat and dairy eating herbivores, we are the only animal to experience atherosclerosis. All right, so that concludes my presentation. These are my latest books. I have a book called America Goes Vegan. All of these have recipes, by the way, vegan recipes. America Goes Vegan, which is a book that has a little bit about the environment and that has a lot of comfort food recipes. Own Your Health, which is a book about nutrition and has recipes by Chef AJ. Food is Climate, which is about some of the material I went over in the first part of this presentation about how the leading cause of climate change is in fact animal agriculture. And my friend Chef AJ has this new dessert book that I helped her with called Sweet Indulgence. And now I have a podcast called The Glen Merzer Show, and I would certainly appreciate it if you check that out on YouTube and subscribed. And with that, I will stop the share.